Welcome back to Real America's Voice coverage of tonight's vice presidential debate. Now, 14 of America's presidents first held the vice presidency. On 8 occasions, they became president following the death or assassination of a president. 1 followed a presidential resignation. 4 others served as vice president and then went on to run and win election to the country's top office. So historically speaking, there's a near 30% chance that the person elected vice president will eventually hold the presidency. But of course, the vice presidency is an office that has had its critics, and the vice presidency has known no harsher critics than the men who've occupied the office. Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president, John Nance Garner, famously said, quote, "The vice presidency isn't worth a bucket of warm spit." At the time, the VP slot wasn't a promotion. Instead, it was often viewed as a one-way ticket to political oblivion. Now, this was a sentiment shared by America's first vice president, John Adams. Adams said, "My country, in its wisdom, has contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Now, the harshest critic of the number 2 spot came from a former staffer to then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. And they said it was a time of deprivation. They said that Johnson grew very fat and drank a lot, that he took up some golf, he recalled, but not with enthusiasm. So while a majority of vice presidents don't make it higher than the number 2 spot, as we mentioned, on 14 occasions in American history, the nation looked to the presidential understudy, as Vice President Dick Cheney often called the post, to later become the nation's commander-in-chief. In the beginning of America's independence, the vice presidency was awarded to the runner-up in the election for president. So in 1796, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were sworn in as president and vice president respectively, despite having been opponents in that year's election. Now, needless to say, this made governing a little bit challenging, but it wasn't until the next presidential election in the year 1800 that the flaws of this system came to the fore. When Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr received the exact same number of electoral votes. The Constitution dictated that the president would then be decided by the House of Representatives. They voted to elect Jefferson president, and in short order, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, changing the way we elect vice presidents. Now, nearly 40 years later, for the first time in American history, a president died in office. It was our 9th president, William Henry Harrison, had only been in office for 31 days when he died of pneumonia. Vice President John Tyler was promptly sworn in as the nation's 10th president. In 1865, at the tail end of the Civil War, when John Wilkes Booth famously snuck into Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and shot and killed President Abraham Lincoln, the plot to kill Lincoln had included at the time failed plans to assassinate Andrew Johnson, who'd only been vice president for 6 weeks before the assassination of Lincoln propelled him to the presidency. And in 1901, one of America's most highly regarded presidents ascended to the office upon the death of his president. That was when Teddy Roosevelt had been vice president for only 6 months when President McKinley was shot and killed in Buffalo, New York. Now, in 1945, as World War II was winding down, President Franklin Roosevelt dumped his 2-term vice president, Henry Wallace, from the ticket. His advisors felt that President Roosevelt, whose health was in serious decline, might not make it through his 4th term. FDR's advisors were in search for the next vice president with the understanding that that person may very well become the next president. And they settled on Missouri Senator Harry Truman. Now, as vice president, Truman was routinely left out of the loop. Many historians even claim that when Truman was sworn in as president after a mere 82 days, he was unaware of the United States nuclear weapons program. Now, a decade after Truman left office, another president died in office. In November 1963, it was President John Kennedy who was assassinated while riding in an open car in Dallas, Texas. Now, the Secret Service raced the president to a nearby hospital, but less than 60 minutes later, President Kennedy was pronounced dead. So for the 8th time, an unscheduled extraordinary presidential inauguration oath took place, that time aboard Air Force One. It was Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was often remembered for his caustic relationship with the Kennedy political dynasty, who became the 36th president of the United States. America has had 45 presidents, and only one has left office alive before their term expired. That was President Richard Nixon, who resigned the office of president in 1974. Nixon's resignation triggered the inauguration of America's 38th president, Gerald Ford. And to this day, President Ford remains the only person in history to hold the office of president and vice president without winning election to either office by the Electoral College. So 14 times, 14 American presidents ascended from the vice presidency, which means that the stakes couldn't be higher tonight. The choice for vice president is as important in this election as it has been at any time in the history of the country. So now let's use this time to take a look back at some of the most memorable moments in vice presidential debate history. And this is a famous one that many of you will remember.
I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.